1814, the second summer of the War of 1812, which had been a bitter but small-scale conflict. Since the beginning of hostilities between the United States of America and the United Kingdom, the Americans had eyed the prize of Canada, but the belief that the territory claimed by the British would keel over without much of a fuss proving to be far from reality. Multiple invasion attempts had been repelled by British, Canadian, and native might, as well as military incompetence on the American side. But the Niagara campaign of 1814 is starting to show signs of change. Thus far in the summer, the American Army, under the command of Jacob Brown, swiftly moved across the Niagara River into Canada to take Fort Erie. From there, Brown's forces collided with the British at the Battle of Chippewa on July the 5th in the United States victory. Although the British were shaken by Chippewa, news came from Europe that the wars against Napoleon Bonaparte were seemingly over, meaning complete attention could now be diverted to the plight in North America. The Americans are seeking a decisive victory as soon as possible before they find themselves handling the might of the British military. On the 25th of July, the Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada, Gordon Drummond, arrives at Fort George, the British stronghold on the Niagara Peninsula. Orders were given for a column of British to move out of Fort Niagara down the eastern side of the river, hoping to threaten to cut off the Americans' escape route and force Brown to retreat. But Brown was aggressive and continued north, aiming to push the British back into Fort George's defenses, unaware that a force under the command of Phineas Riddell was positioned just northwest of the Niagara Falls, on the heights covered by a lone church and cemetery on a small road called Lundy's Lane. These mostly open heights with trees to the west and east made it a perfect defensive battlefield. But fearing the aggressiveness of the Americans, Riddell ordered a retreat back to the safety of Fort George, sending a second unit up the road to cover their retreat. In the afternoon, the American division of Winfield Scott begins moving up the road to Chippewa, just as Riddell is in the process of leaving the heights. When Drummond hears of Riddell's movements, he orders the British in haste back to Lundy's Lane. Riddell hurriedly deploys his division back on the heights, bouncing his flanks with several artillery pieces in the center. It's not a moment too soon as Scott appears in the open and begins to ready his men for battle, placing 3 cannons upon the edge of the woods. It's evening when the first shots are fired, as Scott's line advances for offense and makes their initial movement toward the heights of Lundy's Lane. The British artillery quickly opens fire and tears up the ground around the Bluecoats. Scott sends word to Brown of the early engagement and presses the attack toward the British right flank. While Glengarry's light infantry is occupied by the 9th U.S., the 25th U.S., under the command of Thomas Jessup, uses an old boat launching road to move around the left flank of the British. They catch the Redcoats there off guard, bursting out of the woods. The Upper Canadian militiamen are able to temporarily blunt Jessup's first flank attack, but the second dislodges the entire left flank of the British. The fighting grows fierce, and in the chaos, several British soldiers and officers are taken prisoner. But any gain by the Americans soon becomes lost when the 25th collide with the arriving British column under Drummond's command. Drummond takes command of the field, gives orders to the right flank to pull back north of the church in order to regroup, but by doing so, the vital artillery in the center is left exposed. At this critical juncture, Jacob Brown leads his column of U.S. infantry onto the field just as night settles over the site. Strategic hill had to be taken in order to achieve victory, and that task would fall upon the brigade of Eleazar Ripley. Ripley would place the 21st U.S. Infantry at the head of the attack. Using the fence light for the cover, the regiment, under the command of James Miller, began to pick off the British artillery crews, using the orange glow of the linstocks for targets. Sensing the center weakening, the brigade charged, rushing into the small cemetery where the British gunmen tried to hold fast. And a tense melee ensued between the 21st U.S. and the 89th Foot, who rushed in desperate to try to hold the center. But soon Ripley's brigade outweighs the British and starts to force them out of the cemetery and north of Lundy's Lane. The British column of Colonel Hercules Scott arrived on the field, exhausted from a day of marching and counter-marching, and were not prepared for the sight of their own comrades fleeing from the Stars and Stripes. They too took flight, leaving their artillery of 6-pounders open for capture. Only one regiment, the 41st Foot, dared to try and reclaim their pieces. Though they would take heavy casualties, they managed to pull the artillery out of the hands of the Americans. Brown soon rode up with the remainder of the army to secure the heights of Lundy's Lane, in an attempt to turn the abandoned British artillery battery against their makers. In the chaos of the night, Drummond had been badly wounded in the neck, but refused to leave the field. He was determined to turn the tide of a battle he had seemingly lost. In the dark, he began ordering his men south to recapture the lane. Unbeknownst to anyone, Winfield Scott had regrouped his brigade into one single battalion and was looking to rejoin the battle. The first British counterattack was stumped by the musketry of Rightful. A second wave met a similar fate, but as the second wave retreated, Scott's brigade rushed up the Chippewa Road and gave chase to the British. Brown, not knowing of Scott's movements, had no means to ward the Americans, who accidentally fired into the flanks of their own soldiers. Scott's brigade became decimated by both British and American gunfire. His brigade soon fell back to the left flank, trying desperately to avoid friendly fire. Scott tried to ride off to find the 25th U.S., who was still guarding the right flank, but soon fell wounded. It was now 10 p.m. Both sides were gravely exhausted, but Drummond again ordered a third assault upon the lane. The fatigue had worn down the Americans, who slowly began to cave in. They gradually fell back to the church, where the British rushed in to reclaim their cannons. Some of the most gruesome fighting of the entire war soon played out, with bayonet charges and hand-to-hand combat ensuing within the setting of a cemetery. Jacob Brown fell wounded, and the Americans gave up the field to the British. Ripley took charge of the drained American force, but upon hearing that both water and ammunition supplies were gravely low and midnight approaching, he decided to give up the battle. The British, fatigued by marching and fighting of the day, slept where they stood, some sleeping among the dead around the church. At daybreak, one British surgeon would best describe the scene. Such a scene of carnage I never beheld. Redcoats in blue and gray were promiscuously intermingled, in places 3 deep, and around the knoll the carcasses of 60 or 70 horses disfigured the scene. The Americans had suffered 174 dead, with another 700 wounded, captured, or missing. The British suffered similarly, with 84 dead and nearly 800 wounded, captured, or missing. Although the Americans had captured and pushed the British off the heights, the poor visibility in the dark had unraveled order and forced them to begin where they had started earlier in the day. Against the advice of Brown and Scott, Ripley ordered a retreat south. It is because of this that the British Army would claim victory at Lundy's Lane. Drummond was now certain to see annihilation of the Americans and pinned them down at Fort Erie in a month-long siege that produced heavy losses to both sides. Though Americans would survive the siege, low on supplies, they would destroy the fort and retreat back across the Niagara River. The U.S. would never again invade Canada, and by the end of the year, the war would reach a conclusion. The Battle of Lundy's Lane sums up the entire War of 1812, a stalemate with nothing gained from the blood lost.